guys noticed that since the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles have come out, that as more games specifically designed for 9th generation hardware have rolled out, that games are just looking worse and worse the further into the generation that we get? Every game just has this weird, muddy, ghosty look to it now. Like, just something's not right. That's like you're watching a YouTube video of a game rather than it being on your TV itself. Despite these being advertised as 4K consoles, you can make an argument that PlayStation 4 and Xbox One era games look much cleaner than games made for much more powerful hardware, which is baffling. And even then, a lot of these 9th generation games don't really look that much better than their 8th generation predecessors. So what's going on here? Well, in this video, I am going to deep dive into this topic and talk about why this is the case, and how the video game industry is using this mask of inevitable technological progress to cover up a lot of really bad decisions and also their own incompetence. Now, I am going to give a fair bit of warning here because this video is going to get a little bit technical. There's a lot of terminology here that sounds like alien gibberish to the average normal person. If terminology like GPU, DLSS, native resolution scares you, this video is not really for you. But I promise I will hold your hand and try to explain step by step by step. Also, quick disclaimer, when I'm talking about a lot of the subjects in this video, I'm primarily talking about it in the perspective of single-player AAA games. That it's not to say that multiplayer games don't also do this, or indie games also don't have a lot of the same things going on, but specifically, the AAA gaming space in single-player really seems to be the ground zero for a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, and really seems to just keep escalating it further and further out of control. Now, before we deep dive, I need to sort of cover the overall topic of video game graphics, because it's such a broad terminology that means a lot of different things, and we need to kind of separate it into distinct components in order to explain what exactly is going on. So there are actually 3 distinct components that combine together into video game graphics. There's game assets, resolution, and image quality. Firstly, you have game assets, which is the stuff that is actually inside of the game. Stuff like 3D models, textures, particle effects, etc. Usually when the average gamer talks about a video game having good graphics, they usually mean that the game assets look incredibly detailed and nice and pretty. Secondly is the resolution that the game renders at. I mean, resolution, I'm sure you know what that is. And the amount of pixels that the game draws in order to show you all of the game assets. And the third and most obscure component of this is image quality. And developers have really spent a lot of time not just making games run at a higher resolution and make game assets look better, but also improving the quality of the image itself. It's where anti-aliasing, the technology that reduces or minimizes stair-stepping artifacts of things in the game screen, comes from. So when people talk about that 9th generation games look really bad, they are specifically often referring to the image quality itself, irrespective of the game assets or the resolution. Games in this aspect have really regressed a ton, even compared to the PS4 and Xbox One era. Now, the next logical question you might be thinking, okay, why exactly has image quality taken a nosedive in the past couple of years? And that's a good question. That's really complicated, but really sort of comes down to 2 fundamental things. The introduction of advanced upscaling options into the video game industry, and secondly, being developers just going absolutely ham, hog wild, uncontrolled, abusing this technology and destroying the image quality as a result. So let's address that first topic, video game upscaling. What exactly is that referring to? Well, it refers to a set of software algorithms developed by a lot of the tech giants within the video game industry around the late 2010s and early 2020s. What upscaling does is that instead of rendering your game at the target output resolution that you desire, it instead renders it at a lower base resolution, does a bunch of software calculations on it in order to fill in the missing pixels in order to get you to that final output resolution. This effectively allows you to have the best of both worlds. It allows you to have a high resolution image, but with the performance benefits much closer to the base resolution that you are upscaling from. These upscalers also have the benefit of being really, really nice anti-aliasing functions as well, way better than any previous form of anti-aliasing. Now, this upscaling technology is effectively the silver bullet that solves 4K rendering. 4K is such an expensive resolution on the GPU side to try to render, and so upscaling allows us to create something that looks really, really good without having the heavy performance impact that comes with it. Now, why exactly was this upscaling technology even invented in the first place? Well, the reason is that the tech side of the video game industry foresaw a drop-off in performance increases as time went on. That for traditional forms of game rendering, over time, the performance jumps that we would see from console to console, generation to generation, would be decreasing, if not plateau outright. They had to sit and ask themselves, how are there other ways that we can more effectively use semiconductor silicon to increase graphics performance rather than going down this dead-end path? And as a result of a lot of self-reflection and millions of dollars in research, it has led to this philosophy of what I call highest qualities pixels approach.
We used, of course, programmable shading and ray-traced acceleration to produce incredibly beautiful pixels. But then we have artificial intelligence be conditioned, be controlled by that pixel to generate a whole bunch of other pixels. Not only is it able to generate other pixels spatially, because it's aware of what the colors should be, it has been trained on a supercomputer back in Nvidia, and so the neural network that's running on the GPU can infer and predict the pixels that we did not render.
This philosophy asks, hey, instead of having the GPU just draw tons and tons of these pixels, why not instead just draw a much lower resolution image, but use all of that spare rendering power that you have now and put it into the game assets and the fidelity and just make the game look the absolute best that it can. But as PC players know, if you keep your frame rate consistent but increase graphical fidelity, then your resolution has to go down as a result. And once that image is rendered, we can then use an upscaler to upscale back up to that high resolution instead. As the upscaler is more computationally efficient at creating a high resolution image from a lower base resolution image than just trying to draw the high resolution image from the get-go. The first of these upscaling technologies to be introduced was by Nvidia, their deep learning supersampling, or DLSS upscaling, in 2018. And for a few years is a very futuristic PC-only feature, spoken in hushed whispers, console gamers really not getting the idea of, oh my gosh, this is literally free performance, and my game, like, looks better too? Insane! But the thing about DLSS upscaling is that it is feature-locked to Nvidia graphics cards. You can't use it on any competition's GPU. This is really important in a second. Now, DLSS's reign as the only upscaler of its kind ends in 2022, when Nvidia's competitor, AMD, releases FSR software upscaling. The most important thing you need to know about FSR software upscaling is that it is open source, that it doesn't just work on AMD's GPUs exclusively, it works on competitors' GPUs as well. But not just in the PC space, but it also can run on the Xbox and PlayStation consoles, and even the Switch as well. This release gave AAA developers effectively a green light to start building their render pipelines entirely around upscaling, since now the consoles could do it as well. Now this is where the problems start, because FSR software upscaling is not what I would call good. For my primary example here, I'm going to be using Star Wars Jedi Survivor running on a base PlayStation 5. Now when you're standing completely still or moving the camera very, very slowly to look at the beautiful sights, the game looks incredibly stunning, but we obviously don't play video games standing still now, do we? Any upscaler can just make a barely moving image look good. The real test is how things look when you're moving, let alone in fast-paced acquisition sequences if your game is an action game. Do you notice how there is always this weird artifacting around Cal Kestis anytime he moves?
he's just surrounded by this blurry mess of pixels. And that mess of pixels is FSR software upscaling. That means that in any third-person game, you are just going to have constant visual artifacting around your player character that will not go away. But the problems don't end there. These upscaling algorithms do not work consistently with all game content. In Jedi Survivor, the area that upscaling looks the absolute best in is Jeddah, the desert planet. Jeddah's flat colors and lack of small, intricate detail makes FSR software upscaling work at its best. But that doesn't mean that the artifacting is gone at all. It is still there, but it helps that the desert coloring and texture work hides a bit of the artifacting a little better than the other planets.
Saved my life a couple times.
As intended.
Now, to challenge the upscaler a bit more, we're going to go to the planet Kobo, which features a lot of plant life. Anytime there's a significant amount of plant life on screen, the image quality starts to look worse, since the plants have a much finer amount of detail that the upscaler really cannot interpolate it well. And so as a result, for the entire frame, even stuff that is not the plant life, it just starts looking worse. And then we have the worst case scenario for our upscaler in this game, which is the big laser within the moon base area. Now, this laser is supposed to have a large amount of crazy particle effects going on to show you how dangerously powerful it is, to emphasize how important it is to stay out of the way. However, anytime that this laser fires on screen, it tanks the image quality pretty badly, to the point that it looks like a low-resolution YouTube video. I don't know if you can see it, but oh my gosh, you look at how gross that is. Look at, like, that's not even pixels anymore. That's just blobs.
Take this.
The main problem with FSR software upscaling is in the name, that it's software-based. That it uses the traditional GPU cores that's also used for drawing the game graphics to do the calculations, which is great for openness and compatibility, but does not provide the best image quality. In comparison to Nvidia's DLSS, it uses AI accelerators on their GPU trained on neural network models, and as a result, just creates a much cleaner image as a result. Another way that DLSS is flat out better is that the quality of it relative to the base resolution dropping just tends to be higher. See, these upscalers don't just work in set intervals where it upscales, say, 1440p to 4K or 1080p to 4K. They actually have a wide variety of options of what resolution to upscale from and what resolution to upscale to. That you can go even as low as having 33% of the image's pixels only be natively drawn, and have the upscaler take care of the rest. And how your upscaler handles with these lower pixel counts relative to upscaling to the final output is really a big differentiating factor among all of these algorithms and which ones are preferable. And this is kind of why FSR software upscaling is considered a joke among PC gamers, that really the sweet spot for FSR software upscaling really only is scaling 1440p to 4K exactly. Any sort of other combination, scaling from 1080p to 4K, or scaling like 960p to 1440p, or scaling 720p to 1440p, looks really bad, has a bunch of really bad visual artifacts. It really only works on high-end graphics cards, because if you have the GPU power to run a game at like 4K already to use these upscaling features, then you're not spreading the field evenly across the entire user base. This is one of the fundamental flaws of upscalers, that as you go lower and lower in base resolution, regardless of your final output resolution, that the image just starts looking grosser, that when you start getting into things like scaling from 1080p or scaling from 720p or 540p, the image starts really looking really artifacty and really gross, because there's literally just not enough pixels for the upscalers to start referencing. Do you see where I'm going with this? All right, so some time passes after AMD releases FSR software upscaling, and developers start implementing it in PS5 and Xbox Series games in 2022, 2023, 2024. And man, they really did not stay in the sweet spot at all.
Performance mode drops that range to 864p up to 1152p. There's a temporal upscale in place on both sides, resolving to a 4K image, but expectedly, it has a bigger uphill battle with more reconstruction artifacts with that 60fps mode. PS5 and Series X targets 4K using AMD's FSR 2.1 temporal upscaling. The base resolution this is scaling from, though, is a much lower figure, at 1280 by 720 on each.
Performance mode in comparison seems to top out at 1080p, but often drops a lot lower, knocking on the door of 720p from what I can tell.
And in terms of the resolution in performance mode, we're looking at a dynamic 1152p with drops to 648p lowest.
There are a large amount of 9th generation only PS5 and Xbox Series X games that, if you pixel peep, are actually running at a base resolution of 720p. 720p! Not the Series S, which I guess you could expect would be your base resolution of 720p. I'm talking about the big boy consoles. 720p. 720p. You know, a resolution that's lower than what PlayStation 4 games rendered at on average. And as a result, the image quality just looks so horrifically bad.
And even the detailing on our hand here turns into this pixelated noise anytime we switch amulets.
The core issue underlying image quality taking a nosedive among 9th generation AAA games is that this philosophy of highest quality pixels has just so rampantly taken over the industry, yet the key component to making the whole thing work, where there are no trade-offs and there are no downsides to this approach, the upscaler, is just not technologically there yet. Not on the console side, and not on the PC side. Game developers, at least on the console side, are trading off resolution for visual fidelity, which is not a trade-off I'm necessarily against in theory, but then slap the worst upscaler on top of it, far outside of its sweet spot, in the worst case scenario, and they're just defeating the whole point of their own philosophy.
It also doesn't help, in my opinion, that many of the people who directly worked on creating these upscale technologies, when confronted about the over-abuse of their upscalers, just weirdly seem to try to sidestep any sort of deeper discussion about it. Listen to this interview with the head architect of the PS5 and the PS5 Pro, Mark Cerny.
Yeah. I think with PSSR, a lot of people are pretty interested in a certain kind of problem, which is that you have a pretty tremendous improvement in image quality. And I think we see this across, different kinds of PC upscalers as well when we're talking about that. But the internal resolution of that imagery might not be changing that much relative to what you saw before. So are you guys kind of trying to figure out how to message that to people and tell people this is a profoundly improved image despite the fact that the internal resolution is comparable? And I know that we're part of this problem for sure, so that's a tough thing to message, but have you thought about that?
You're not part of the problem. And I've heard you talk. I spend too much time on DF, but I've heard you talk about how you really shouldn't be looking at internal rendering resolution and drawing too much in the way of conclusions from that. You really need to be looking at image quality. And I was trying to communicate exactly the same message today, is we need to change the way we're talking about resolution. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about it at all. The difficulty is, if you don't have a number, right, it's very hard to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think Mark Cerny really said anything objectively wrong, but also I feel like he's not getting why people are so mad about this in general. The reason why people care so much about the base resolution number, it is an important determining factor in image quality with these current crop of upscalers.
And with console games running at 720p, that also has the knock-on effect of making games extremely demanding as a result. Another weird aspect to all of this is that the highest quality pixels approach has this weird self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to it. One cannot help but wonder, with how ridiculously more demanding games have become overnight, that developers are not creating the problem themselves in order to justify the solution that they wanted to use in the first place. Another thing about developer implementations of upscalers that bother me in particular is that it kind of seems to be insulting the intelligence of the gamer. That it's built on top of this weird logic that you're supposed to notice the upscaling, but not notice it too much, if that makes any sense. Like, the whole point of using these upscalers is to make games look higher resolution. And you're supposed to obviously notice that. That's why developers even put it in. But then you're simultaneously supposed to not notice all of the ugly visual artifacts that come along with it. This contradictory logic, at least on the console side, seems to be built on top of the idea that at the average viewing distance a gamer sits from their TV, that the visual artifacts are just sort of going to blend in and the resolution benefits will stand out much more. Whereas on the PC side, with upscaling, since gamers sit much closer to their monitors and PC gamers just tend to overanalyze every single frame, that they are going to notice and be bothered by upscalers much more than console users. Now, I know up to now I've really been focusing mainly on the console side of gaming, but PC gamers have kind of a similar problem happening, but not quite exactly. Now, on the PC side, given that there's no set specifications of hardware, every option has to be customizable to work on whatever. And that means including opting out of upscaling. So at least on PC, to a certain extent, you can kind of avoid upscaling by just deciding to not turn it on and accepting like the performance penalties if a game is just designed with it in mind. But for the PC players who are engaging with upscaling to actually get decent performance out of their games, the upscalers have inadvertently created this very extreme class divide in the PC space that really you can't quite quantify with numbers exactly. Since no matter which upscaler that you use, that they all get better image clarity the higher your base resolution is. That means that if your GPU is more powerful enough than the demands of the game, you're just going to get an objectively cleaner image when you turn on upscaling. And as a result, it creates two different experiences depending on like your class of hardware. That if you're running like a GPU that's like $1,000 plus and you're playing the latest AAA games that are all super demanding, that is effectively free performance and your image quality does look a little better as a result because you just have inherently so much base headroom to improve from. While people who have much less expensive graphics cards, you know, the actual average PC gamer, they really have like no good options here. They either have to just like suck it up, not play with an upscaler, and have a clean image but like bad performance, or they engage with the upscaler and get decent performance, but have to deal with like really, really bad image quality as a result.
But our GPU is only able to pump out like 40 FPS or something like that. And that kind of frame rate is what gets me like, oh, any way to get this to run at 60 FPS at 1080p. We can try a little bit of upscaling. We can try Nvidia's DLSS here. Yes, this isn't 1080p anymore, but we can go to quality, upscaling. See that we were at like the low to mid 40s and now we're at like 50 or so.
Now, if you watch a lot of Digital Foundry game breakdowns like I do, that 720p number just seems really random. Like, why are all of these developers just obsessed with going down to 720p on the consoles? Well, here's the reason why, with Mark Cerny basically giving the whole game away.
When fewer higher quality pixels are combined with the right neural network, the result is richer graphics. One way to look at this is supportable upscaling ratio. If we're able to create quality imagery with a 2-to-1 upscale, and can then improve the neural network and reach the same image quality with a 3-to-1 upscale, then the effective power of the GPU has roughly doubled. And that stacks on top of whatever is being done to speed up rasterized rendering or ray tracing. There's enormous potential here.
And you know what? The math actually does check out on that.
Now, I have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on my PC set up here as an example. Now, yes, I am using mods to insert upscalers of FSR and XeSS, so this is not a proper developer implementation. We're just purely looking on how the performance characteristics of these upscalers work in general. All right, so my first example here, we have the game running at a native 4K resolution, hanging out in the very low 40s, high 30s, which is fine, but it's not ideal for a PC gaming use case. Now in the second clip here, I am using FSR software upscaling with a base resolution of 720p. Now, in this gameplay footage that you're seeing here, we're seeing the FPS hang out in the high 80s, low 90s range. meaning that we did double our performance, actually a little bit more so. Now, granted, yes, this is not the same upscaler as PSSR, but in general, this very much tracks between all the upscalers. Okay, so doubling your performance compared to native 4K, I will say is pretty good and is a very clever trick. But I also feel like it's reinventing the wheel for no real reason, because I can think of an extremely easy way that you can easily double your performance in your render budget without having to resort to just awful image upscaling that destroys the image quality. And that's just to render the game at native 1080p.
Okay, so in FF7 Rebirth, I just set the game's resolution to 1920 by 1080 and ran it with TAAU, so no upscaling or anything like that. And we actually are sitting in the high 90s, low 100s range. We're getting more than double the performance than if we were trying to upscale from 720p all the way to 4K.
Clearly, I have vastly outsmarted the thousands of graphics programmers all simultaneously working on this problem, working at multi-billion-dollar companies and very complex algorithms. But okay, let's cut Mark Cerny some slack here, because obviously he and many other people are working on improving these upscalers. I'm sure that this is just going to be a weird, awkward phase like any new graphical trend in the industry. That we're just going to have this weird couple of years with really blurry and artifacty type games, and developers are just building their render budgets around the upscalers that are too early. But my counter argument to that is I think that this is not even necessarily a technological problem of there not being an upscaler that's good enough, but rather I feel like this technology facilitates a lot of bad developer behavior. Take, for example, the introduction of the PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, or PSSR, with the release of the PlayStation 5 Pro. This is a proprietary upscaler developed by PlayStation for use in their own consoles, and it is objectively better than the FSR software upscaling that was previously being used on the console by third parties, just by the fact that it is an AI machine learning based upscaler. A lot of observations and tech enthusiasts have found that the sweet spot for PSSR tends to be a base resolution of 1080p or higher looks good. Anything below that starts to get very dicey. And despite all that, developers still will not work within the sweet spot of these upscalers. There were games on the PS5 Pro's launch day that were not running in the sweet spot. Most infamously, Alan Wake 2 ran at a base resolution of 864p in the performance mode, and as a result, it looks legitimately gross.
Be better, like the camera moving here, like looking at the power lines or looking at Saga's hair. It's a bit more like pixels are sticking out more. They're showing their face more often, kind of like flickering in and out of the image. And there's a different level of stability there when things are movement. Or like when I push the camera forward here in this scene, you can see the same thing on like the left hand side of Saga there in regards to like the power lines or the trees or the signs and the amount of flickering and aliasing that comes up there.
That A64p number is particularly peculiar because it is the same resolution that the base PlayStation 5 runs performance mode at. But the thing is that the Pro has about 50% more regular GPU rendering power than the base PlayStation 5. They could have had the performance mode run at like 1080p within PSSR's sweet spot and then get a nice, beautiful, clean upscale. But what's baffling is that Remedy chose, instead of boosting the base resolution to the sweet spot where PSSR works best, they decided to put all of that rendering power into the graphical fidelity at the same resolution that they had it on the base PlayStation 5 for some reason. The introduction of PSSR and developers still not following guidelines show me that this is not purely an issue of technology that has not been entirely developed yet, but rather it has enabled a serious amount of developer behavior, of just abusing these upscalers beyond a reasonable use case. The only developers that I have seen use upscalers in a reasonable use case way, at least on the console side, is PlayStation first-party studios with PSSR. That's it. There's nobody else. So where exactly is the floor when it comes to all of this upscaling? Because I know Mark Cerny has talked about 720p being the industry goal because of that 2x performance number, but I mean, theoretically, you could go even lower. I mean, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 games looked pretty good for their time, and they weren't even 720p a lot of the time. So, I mean, we could go even lower, right? 600p, 540p, 480p. I mean, where exactly is the bottom here? I mean, 720p makes sense as the floor, given that it is HD, but it's a low enough resolution that it's not super demanding and has enough data in it that you can inference and make a higher resolution version of it. But I mean, that's kind of what people thought about the sweet spots for some of these other upscalers. In fact, I'm even going to go one step further and specifically call out Mark Cerny for helping enable this upscaling problem as well. See, as the leader for a technology team working on a closed platform like the PS5 Pro, Mark Cerny really had an opportunity to set an example for the rest of the industry by putting some guardrails up for all of this upscaler nonsense. So I do not understand why Mark Cerny and his team did not enforce any sort of quality control or baseline that developers have to meet before they can even start using PSSR. Something like, I don't know, maybe your base resolution has to be 1080p in order to be able to start using this. And I'm sure the reason why is probably because they don't want to make developers mad by limiting their options with PSSR. But, I mean, who cares, really? I'm sure Mark Cerny could say, listen, dude, the PS5 Pro has 50% more traditional game rendering performance than the base PS5. It has 2 to 3 times the ray tracing performance. If you cannot get your game to run at 1080p on the Pro, that's a you problem. And yes, I know doing something like this is not that simple because so many games now are built on temporal data from previous frames. So what even is 1080p? And like dynamic resolution scaling plays a factor. So what if you drop below 1080p? Like in a very intense moment, do you just lose PSSR? But the idea of Mark Cerny just not putting in any guardrails whatsoever just seems crazy to me. Now, I know that the common counter argument to people like me complaining about games being over demanding is that, well, this is natural. The new consoles come out and come up with a new baseline, and game demand just pretty significantly shoots up because of this new hardware. But the problem with that line of thinking is that for every previous example of game demand increasing suddenly because of a new set standard of hardware consoles, that you could see where all of that hardware power was going, even as like a layman consumer. But ninth generation games are particularly unique in that that same sort of like performance demand increase is there, and yet it seems like the performance is just entirely evaporating. That doesn't really seem like it's translating into games that really look all that much better compared to 8th generation games.
Now, for my primary example for games that just really don't look that much better for how much more demanding that they are, I want to talk about Final Fantasy 16. 16 was a game that was designed for the ground up for the PlayStation 5 and was released in 2023 and came to PC in 2024. 16 is a comically, absurdly demanding game. On my RX 6800 XT here, playing at a native 1440p, this game just can't even lock to 60 FPS. Playing on medium or even low graphical settings. We have to go down all the way to native 1080p in order to get a locked 60 FPS. Now compare this to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which does look a little worse given that it was a base PlayStation 4 game, but it does have some visual improvements that it got with the PS5 version, which runs at like twice the performance. I can lock my frame rate at 60 at native 4K. Now, don't get me wrong, 16 does look better than 7 Remake, but is it worth it for the game to be twice as demanding to just look that little bit better than 7 Remake?
I think a lot of this really has to do with the fact that we're really at the point of diminishing returns with traditional video game rendering. The developers are just having to throw on these ludicrously heavy effects in order to make any sort of visual difference from PS4 era games. And even then, it's not that much of an improvement, at least in my opinion. I would say that 9th generation AAA games on average look like 10 to 15% better than PS4 games on average. But the amount of rendering power that is being thrown in order to make these games look 15% better is just absolutely ludicrous. Now, I want to talk about a specific game that is really an outlier, an exception even, but really kind of proves that there's something fundamentally wrong deep down going on right now with the industry. And that's Jedi Survivor for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One.
Released initially in 2023 for PlayStation 5, Xbox Series consoles, and PC, Jedi Survivor was designed as a 9th generation only game. It was only in late 2024 that it was backported for a PlayStation 4 and Xbox One release. What makes this port notable and interesting is that it strips Jedi Survivor down to its most essential elements in order to get it to run on older hardware. The expectation for a port like this is that it's going to be a disaster visually. I think about those ports of the Mortal Kombat games on Switch, 11 and 1. Those games had art that was designed with 8th and 9th generation hardware in mind. But trying to get these to run on Switch, you have to strip out so much stuff. And the art is clearly not designed in a way that all those graphical features are stripped out. So how does Jedi Survivor fare on PS4? And you know what? This port doesn't actually look that bad. Both from a closer viewing distance and on normal TV viewing distance, the game actually looks pretty good in my opinion. And when you compare it to the actual PS5 version, it's not as big of a gap as you'd think. That's not to say that the port itself is perfect. If you run it on a real PlayStation 4, it's going to be a pretty rough time. Rather, it's the game's secret PS5 mode that's really fascinating and interesting. See, this game doesn't just support the base PS4, but also the PS4 Pro, bumping up the resolution to 864p on the Pro and smoothing out a lot of those frame rate drops. And specifically, when playing the PS4 version on the PS5, the game now runs at 60 FPS instead of 30 on the PS4. This obscure mode is really one of the few examples of a 9th generation game built from the ground up, where all of the performance hogging graphical effects are entirely stripped out. Now imagine a hypothetical world where this level of graphical fidelity for Jedi Survivor was used as the starting point for the PS5 version rather than the overly demanding one that we currently have. Now mind you, this 60 FPS PS5 mode is not even taking full advantage of the PS5's hardware capabilities. I think you could actually run this version of Jedi Survivor at a native 1440p 60 and have it look much, much cleaner than the current Jedi Survivor and not really look that much worse.
The 8th generation version of Jedi Survivor shows that the Emperor has no clothes. This port's existence confirms that AAA developers can make games that still run well and aren't extremely heavy and still look better than PlayStation 4 games, but just decide not to. That all this drum banging about inevitable technological progress and we need to embrace upscaling right now and all this shift towards highest quality pixels is just a total facade. In fact, it seems like the existence of PlayStation 4 and Xbox One as a target platform for games to release on really seems to be the only thing keeping game optimization somewhat in check. But there's a secondary and more nefarious purpose as to why upscalers have been used, and it's sort of the elephant in the room that I really haven't quite addressed yet. I suspect part of the reason why upscalers have become so incredibly popular over the past few years relative to other cutting-edge graphical features is that it is easy for AAA developers to blend in with the crowd to cover for the fact that they are just not finishing optimizing their games. I mean, think about this from an executive perspective. Optimization takes a lot of time and money and adds length to the development process. So if you have this upscaler that can just make things look 4K or UHD or whatever, then you end up saving a lot of money and a lot of time in the process of making a game. Now, in contrast to all the other games that I've talked about in this video, I want to talk about one game that I really appreciate for its approach to how it is using current hardware for 9th generation consoles and current GPUs, because I feel like this is how the 9th generation should have played out over the long term. Instead of trying to force upscaling a decade early, we should have gone down this direction instead. And that game is Demon's Souls for PS5.
Demon's Souls PS5 was a launch game for the console in 2020, and in my opinion, it is still the best looking console game ever made, bar none. It's incredible how much better this game looks than any PS4 era Souls game, while also having the cleanest image quality that I've ever seen. And mind you, this game was developed and released before the existence of current video game upscalers. This game, I swear to you, has zero aliasing, no rough edges whatsoever in the game. You really can only find anything like that when you push the game down to its 60 FPS mode and you get really, really close to your TV to find any sort of jagged or a little bit too sharp of edge. Now, you look at a game like this and you're wondering what the catch is. Surely the resolution must be really low or something to have image quality this impeccable and graphics this crazy, but it doesn't. It runs at a native 4K in the 30 FPS cinematic mode and at 1440p in the 60 FPS performance mode. Now, there are other games that do have better looking game assets than Demon's Souls PS5, undeniably. But in terms of having a great image quality, you know, what the tech side of the industry claims actually matters, but are actively in the process of destroying, Demon's Souls PS5 really doesn't have any peer competitors whatsoever. It is so far above and beyond almost any other game created for the 9th generation. And I think the most ironic thing of all is that Demon's Souls PS5, despite being somewhat of a rejection of this highest quality pixels approach, does upscaling far better than almost any other game that has come out since. See, as it turns out, Demon's Souls got a PS5 Pro patch at the end of 2024 when that console came out. And it combines what I presume to be PSSR with the base PS5's 1440p 60 performance mode to create something equivalent to the image quality of the base PS5's quality mode with a 4K output. It's genuinely insane that a patch for a 4-year-old game has better image quality than trying to just brute force a modern contemporary Souls-like game like Black Myth Wukong on a $1,000 plus GPU to get any sort of similar image quality. Now, yes, I do understand that Demon's Souls PS5 is very much an outlier in the grand scheme of things, even back when it was released. Bluepoint is very much in the upper echelon of game developers and studios getting the most out of their hardware. It also helps that they're a PlayStation first-party studio. But the fact that in the years since, that no other developers have been trying to do a similar approach with their games since these upscalers have become more prominent is very telling.
Now, despite all of my complaining, I do think that the upscaler situation is not a bleak end, that we're just forced to deal with, like, blurry, artifacty games for the rest of time. I do think that we as consumers can fight back against this trend. The primary thing that makes me think that there is hope is sort of the quality performance mode dynamic that has developed over the past couple of years. For many, many console generations, decades even, PC gamers had always been asking developers, hey, why is 60 FPS not the standard on consoles, if not at least an option? And developers would always say, well, we always want to push visual fidelity, and 60 FPS doesn't allow us to push visual fidelity like 30 does. If you want to play your games at 60 FPS, go play on PC or just suck it up, loser. But the 9th generation has shifted the Overton window of discussion of acceptability. that now it is expected that you have a 60 FPS option for your games, even if it is not a cross-generation game and it only is coming out on 9th generation consoles. I think also conveniently for this generation, games are just so overly hyper-detailed with so many graphical effects going on that if you lower the quality on them or strip a couple of them out, games don't look that much worse in their performance modes compared to quality modes. I really want transparency from developers on this, that instead of hiding behind upscalers as 4K, that they at least say, hey, if you turn off the upscaler, that's on you, but we're gonna run the games like at native resolutions that are not as high as what we advertise. Is that fine with you? At least giving people the choice to do that is better than the current scenario that we have. But informing people is obviously not going to be an overnight process by itself. It's gonna take a lot more videos like this, informing the public, and gamers just pointing out to other players who might not know about the visual artifacts, much like how many years ago people were pointing out the differences between 30 and 60 FPS and informing them about the differences between the two. Now, a final note for the industry side here. I do genuinely believe you guys when you say that we need to do something different regarding the increases in hardware power. I do think that there has to be something done about diminishing returns of performance gains at some point. I think it's pretty obvious based on data that we're coming to a plateau pretty soon. Now, if you had asked me prior to making this video where on the spectrum of the upscaler debate I fell into, between literally indistinguishable from native resolution, solves rendering entirely on the tech side, versus abolish upscalers as a concept, other extreme, I probably sat in the middle. Upscalers are a good idea, but let's not over-abuse them, guys. But the more that I did research, and the more that I figured out that upscalers basically just enable bad behavior, and you really cannot disincentivize that bad behavior easily, I have become much more radicalized to the position that we should just not have this technology whatsoever. That I am fine just sticking with PlayStation 4 era graphics if that means that visuals never advance ever again, and we just have a bunch of performance to spare, rather than the current nightmare that we are living in, where games are extremely over-demanding and barely look any better despite how much more demanding that they are, and either force upscalers on us directly via consoles or are expecting us to use upscalers on the PC side. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Do you like video game upscalers? Do you hate video game upscalers? Comment down below about what you think. I did a lot of research for this video. I feel very passionately about this topic because I feel like it's enabled so much, like just from such a simple idea. And I don't really feel like there's been a comprehensive video online that sort of like easily summarizes everybody's problems with upscalers. You sort of have to like brute force knowledge through watching a bunch of PC gaming videos and put the puzzle pieces together. I wanted to lay things out in sort of an easily digestible way. Anyways, if you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe, go down to my Patreon, and give me a couple dollars to incentivize me to make more videos like this. Anyways, guys, that's it, and have a good day.